remember the exact moment the conversation at the table shifted. Not the words, I'll get to those, but the particular quality of silence that followed. The kind where you can hear the ice settling in someone's glass, and everyone at the table suddenly becomes very interested in their food. My boyfriend's father had just finished explaining to me how venture capital actually works. I'm not being dramatic when I say that. He used the phrase how it actually works. He leaned back in his chair, the way people do when they're about to deliver a gift, and he said, "Let me explain how venture capital actually works, because the press gets it wrong 90% of the time." I nodded. I smiled. I picked up my fork. My boyfriend, his name is Declan, which I'm telling you up front because I know nothing is more irritating than a story where someone's partner floats through unnamed for 27 minutes. Declan was sitting next to me and I could feel him go very still. He knew. He didn't say anything, but he knew. I should back up. Declan and I had been together for almost 3 years when I finally met his parents. I know how that sounds. We talked about it plenty of times, but his parents live in Phoenix and we're in Boston, and between his travel schedule and mine, the timing just never lined up into something that felt right. His mom had a knee replacement last spring. His dad was traveling for most of the fall before that. And honestly, I'll be transparent here, I was a little nervous. Declan had described his father, Gus, in ways that made me want to be prepared. He's not difficult, Declan had told me. He's just confident. I've learned that those two things are not always as different as people think. Gus had spent 30 years in finance, not venture capital specifically. He'd been a senior portfolio manager at a large asset management firm, the kind that manages pension funds and institutional money. He retired 4 years ago with a very comfortable life and a very strong sense of how the financial world operates. Declan loves him. I could tell that immediately when we pulled into the driveway of the house in Scottsdale, a sprawling adobe-style home with a courtyard and a fountain that hadn't been turned on yet for the season. And Declan's whole face changed. He relaxed in a way I hadn't seen him relax in months. His mother, Paulette, met us at the door. She was warm in the immediate, instinctive way that some people just are. She hugged me before she'd said more than 4 words, and she smelled like something baking. And she held my hands for a moment after she let go and said, "We have been waiting so long to meet you." She said it like she meant it. I believed her. Gus came out of the study a minute later. He was tall, silver-haired, the kind of physically imposing that doesn't require any effort. He had a firm handshake, and he looked directly at me when we were introduced, which I appreciated. He said, "Declan's told us a great deal about you." "Good things, I hope," I said. He said, "You work in finance." "I do." He nodded once, in a way that seemed to file this information away somewhere. Then he asked Declan about the flight, and we moved inside. Dinner was Paulette's pot roast, which was extraordinary, and a salad with candied pecans and good bread that she'd made herself. The table was set beautifully. There were candles. I could tell this mattered to her, that having us there mattered to her, and I felt grateful and a little guilty about the 3 years it had taken us to get there. The conversation was easy at first. We talked about Scottsdale, about the weather, about Declan's sister who lives in Denver and couldn't make it this trip. Paulette asked me about Boston. She'd lived there briefly in her 20s. And we talked about the neighborhoods, the winters, the particular specific misery of trying to park a car during a snowstorm in the South End. Gus was quieter during this part, attentive, but quiet. I had the sense he was still assessing. Then Paulette asked what I was working on these days. I gave the answer I usually give in social situations, which is a simplified version of the truth, that I work in early-stage investing, that we focus on technology companies, that it's interesting work. Gus set down his knife. "What fund?" he asked. I told him. Something shifted in his expression. Not negatively, more like recalibration. He said the name back to me slowly, the way you do when you're placing something. Then he said, "That's a smaller shop. Boutique." "Yes," I said. "Series A-B focus. Mostly seed and A, with a few B rounds recently." He nodded. Consumer tech, enterprise, enterprise primarily. Some infrastructure plays. There was a pause. Paulette refilled my water glass. Declan reached over and put his hand briefly on my knee under the table, which I interpreted as either affection or a quiet warning. The thing people don't understand about early-stage investing, Gus said, settling back in his chair with the particular ease of someone entering comfortable territory, is that it's really more art than science. And I say this with respect. I've known a lot of VC people over the years. Good people, smart people, but the press has this romanticized version of it that doesn't match the reality. What version is that? I asked. That it's about finding the next big thing. Visionary founders, transformative ideas. He smiled. It was a kind smile, a patient smile. In reality, the decision-making process is much more conservative than people think. It has to be. You're managing risk across a portfolio. Most of your investments will fail. The ones that don't have to return enough to cover the losses and then some. So the skill isn't vision, it's diversification. Risk management. Very similar to what I did for most of my career, actually. Paulette made a small sound that might have been agreement or might have been a gentle attempt to redirect. Declan took a long sip of water. That's one way to look at it, I said. The real challenge, Gus continued, is that most people in venture capital are playing with other people's money without the kind of oversight that protects those people. The LP structure. You know what that is? Limited partners? I do, I said. The LP structure creates a situation where the incentives are misaligned. The fund managers take fees regardless of performance. 2 and 20, right? 2% management fee, 20% carry. So even if the fund underperforms, the managers are comfortable. That's a structural problem. That's why you see so many funds that talk about disruption and end up just recycling capital into the same 10 companies. I looked at my pot roast. It was, as I said, extraordinary. There's also the valuation problem, he said. Early stage valuations have been completely unmoored from fundamentals for the last decade. Companies raising at 200, 300 times revenue, no earnings, no path to earnings. The whole model depends on the next round being larger than the current round, which is, he made a gesture with his hand, which is not how durable value creation works. I don't care how good your pitch deck is. Dad, Declan said mildly, I'm not criticizing. I'm contextualizing. He looked at me with what I think was genuine goodwill. It's a tough industry. I'm sure you work hard. I just want to make sure you have a realistic framework, because a lot of young people come in with stars in their eyes and don't understand the structural. Gus, Paulette said, and there was something in her voice. I'm just saying. I put down my fork, not dramatically, just set it on the side of the plate. No, it's okay, I said. These are fair points. He seemed pleased by this. He leaned forward slightly. The truth is, the best people in BC have usually spent time on the operating side first, actually building companies, not just funding them. Or they come from deep industry expertise. They know a sector cold before they start making bets in it. The generalist approach honestly doesn't produce the best returns over time. What do you consider a good return? I asked. He thought about it. For a top quartile fund, 3x on committed capital over a 10-year fund life. That's real. That's what the data shows. We're at 4.1 on Fund 2, I said. Fund 3 is tracking above that, but it's too early to call. There was a pause. Not long. Maybe 3 seconds, but I've been in enough boardrooms to know that 3 seconds of silence is a significant duration. Those are your fund's numbers? He said. Yes. Over what period? Fund 2 closed in 2019. We returned capital to LPs last year. He was quiet for a moment. Paulette was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Declan had gone completely still in the way he'd been still earlier, except this time I thought I detected the faintest trace of something at the corner of his mouth that he was working to suppress. That's a strong return, Gus said finally. We had some good bets. What sectors? And then something happened that I hadn't anticipated when I sat down to dinner that night. Gus started asking real questions. Not rhetorical questions designed to deliver a lesson, but actual questions. The kind you ask when you're genuinely curious and have enough background to understand the answers. He asked about our thesis. He asked how we think about market timing. He asked about the operational support we provide to portfolio companies versus firms that take a more hands-off approach. He asked about our LP base and whether we'd seen any shift in institutional appetite post 2022. These were good questions. They were the questions I'd expect from someone in the industry. I answered them honestly. I told him that our thesis has always been enterprise software with a particular focus on workflow automation, the unsexy, mission-critical kind that doesn't make headlines but produces extraordinary retention metrics. I told him we'd been early to several companies in that space before digital transformation became something every Fortune 500 CEO said in their earnings calls. I told him we'd been wrong plenty of times too, and about some of the bets we'd gotten wrong and why. Paulette got up at some point to bring out dessert. A peach cobbler, because she is apparently a person who exists in a warmer and more generous universe than the rest of us. And somewhere in the transition from dinner to dessert, the conversation just kept going. Gus asked about our current fund size. I told him. He nodded slowly. That's a meaningful amount of capital to be deploying at seed stage, he said. It requires discipline, I said. We have to be willing to say no to a lot of things that look interesting. The easiest mistake in this business is letting deal flow drive your decisions. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think I owe you an apology. I looked at him. I made some assumptions at the beginning of this conversation, he said. He wasn't uncomfortable about it exactly, more like he was someone who was used to being accurate and had noticed an error he wanted to correct. I assumed I was explaining things you didn't know. That was presumptuous. You were sharing your perspective, I said. There's nothing wrong with that. No. He shook his head. I was lecturing. Declan's mother has told me I'd do that. Once or twice, Paulette said, coming back to the table with the cobbler. Once or twice, Gus agreed. He looked at me again. How old are you, if you don't mind my asking? 31, I said. He processed this. Who started the fund? I told him. Told him about my partner, Weston, who's 15 years older than me and had the operating background Gus had mentioned, having built and sold 2 software companies before we started the fund together, and about how we'd met, and about the particular conversation 7 years ago where we'd sketched out the thesis on a napkin in a bar in Cambridge, and it had turned out improbably to mostly hold. And you're a general partner, he said. Not quite a question. Managing partner, I said. Weston is as well. It's a 2GP structure. Paulette set the cobbler in the center of the table and sat down and looked between the two of us like she was watching something that had started as one thing and turned into something else. You know, Gus said after a moment, I spent 30 years in institutional asset management. I understood that world very well. But I'll admit, I came to this table thinking I understood yours, and I'm not sure I was as right about that as I thought I was. Finance is a big field, I said. It is. He picked up his dessert spoon. Tell me more about the workflow automation thesis, because my instinct when I was still working would have been to avoid that category. Commodity risk, competitive moats aren't obvious. But if you found companies that produce the retention numbers you're describing, I'm curious what you're seeing that I wasn't. So I told him. I told him about the specific dynamics of enterprise software adoption, about why the most boring-sounding tools are often the stickiest because they get embedded in daily workflows in ways that make switching prohibitively painful. I told him about a company we'd seeded 4 years ago that makes software for hospital credentialing, genuinely tedious, process-heavy work that nobody in the industry had bothered to modernize, and how they'd grown faster than anything flashier in our portfolio, precisely because the problem was real and painful and no one else had cared enough to solve it. Gus listened. He asked follow-up questions. At one point, he pushed back on something I said about market sizing, and I pushed back on his pushback, and for a few minutes, We were just two people arguing about methodology in the particular way that people argue when they both know enough to disagree substantively. Declan, at some point, got up to help Paulette with the coffee. I caught his eye when he came back to the table. He gave me a look I've learned to read over 3 years, something between relief and quiet pride, and a faint residual anxiety that had maybe not fully dissipated. Later, when we were doing dishes, Paulette insisted and I insisted on helping. She said to me, quietly, while Declan and Gus were still at the table talking, "He's not usually like this." "Like what?" I asked. "He doesn't usually admit when he's wrong. He usually just changes the subject." She smiled, rinsing a glass. "Whatever you said, it landed differently." "I don't think I said anything special," I said. "You didn't get defensive," she said. "That's not as common as you'd think." In the car on the way back to the hotel, Declan was quiet for a while. Not unhappy quiet, the other kind. Finally he said, "So." "So," I said. "That went well." It did. He merged onto the highway. The desert was dark on either side of us, a few lights scattered far out, and the sky was enormous in the way it only is when you're away from the city. "I should have warned him," he said. "Before dinner, I should have told him more about what you actually do." "It's okay," I said. "It worked out. He was lecturing you. A little bit. He does that." He glanced at me. "You were incredibly gracious about it. He was genuinely curious once we got past the beginning," I said. "And he asked good questions. A lot of people in his position would have doubled down." Declan thought about this. He really asked good questions? Really good questions, actually. He understood the LP dynamic stuff better than most people do when I explain it. I paused. He built a framework for a completely different area of finance, and he actually tried to apply it. That's more than most people do. We drove in silence for a while. The hotel was about 20 minutes away, and neither of us rushed to fill the quiet. "He texted me," Declan said eventually. "Already, when I was helping with the dishes." He smiled, eyes on the road. He said, and I'm quoting, "Your girlfriend knows her business. Don't mess it up." I laughed. It came out louder than I expected, surprising even me in the quiet of the car. "That's high praise," Declan said. "It really is," I said. And I meant it, not because I needed Gus's approval, and not because the dinner had gone the way I would have scripted it, but because there's something particular about watching a person choose the harder thing, choose curiosity over certainty, choose to say, "I was wrong about that," when they could just as easily have pivoted and pretended the first part hadn't happened. And I had seen Gus do that over a plate of peach cobbler in Scottsdale, and that mattered to me. The highway unspooled in front of us, and Declan put on music low, something quiet and instrumental, and I rested my head against the window and watched the desert go past. I had been nervous about this trip. I hadn't told Declan how nervous exactly, but I had been, and what I found instead of what I feared was something more interesting. A man who had been certain about the wrong things and was willing, when the evidence came in, to update. That, I have learned, is rarer than any fund return I could tell you about.